everyone. Good evening. Thank you for being here today. My name is David Longoria. I'm Councilwoman Laura Pastor's Chief of Staff. She has a scheduling conflict, so she's going to be unable to make it tonight. So I'm just going to kick things off for you, give you a brief overview of how this is going to work tonight. Staff has a presentation that they're going to run through, after which, if you have any comments or questions, we ask that you fill out one of the yellow cards at the back table, and then we'll call you up in order which we receive them, and then we'll have staff on hand to stick around and answer your questions. We also have an interpreter with us this evening in case anybody needs it. Alex is in the back over here. And with that, we'll get started. I'll hand it over to Chris Meyer, the City Clerk.
Thanks, David. Thank you all for being here, coming in to find out some more information about election consolidation. The City Council is considering consolidating the city elections, which are currently held in the fall of odd years, to the fall of even years to put them with the state primary and general election. And the main reason for doing that is they're looking at trying to increase participation. Historically, you look at the data, the participation by voters, for whatever reason, in the state and county elections and federal elections in the fall of even years is higher than in the city elections in the off years. This is not an unusual phenomenon around the country. Turnout in local elections, schools, cities, and towns tends to be lower. And so some jurisdictions have consolidated to try to increase it. But we're going to go over 3 different options the council is looking at and then try to get some feedback from all of you, either questions or your input on what you would like to see the city do. One second here. There we go. Okay, first a little background on city elections. So I said we conduct them in the fall of odd years currently. The city of Phoenix is the second largest election jurisdiction in the state. Obviously, Maricopa County is the largest. We're second. We're bigger than Pima County, which is the third one. Since city elections are nonpartisan, and that's the way they're designed, they have historically been held separate from the county and state elections, which are partisan. So all the way back to incorporation in 1881, the city has conducted its elections at a different time. In 1949, we switched from conducting them in the spring, which many other cities and towns had done for years, to conducting them in the fall of odd years. The city has 713,000 registered voters, again, the second largest jurisdiction in the state. 70% of those voters are on the permanent early voting list. So those voters for city elections automatically receive a ballot by mail and then can vote it and return it. And 95% of the people who vote in city elections cast their ballots by mail. That's by far the most popular method for conducting them. The city has been a leader in innovations in the state in elections for a number of years. We were one of the first to consolidate precincts back in 1987, and then we were the first jurisdiction to have a permanent early voting list. Phoenix actually established theirs in 1996 and used it in 1997 for the first time. The state didn't adopt the state list until 2007, so 10 years later. And we were also the first to develop and use voting centers in Arizona, as several counties and other jurisdictions now are using voting centers. There are 3 options that are being considered by the council for consolidating the elections, and we'll go through the 3 of those and give more details. We go through them a couple of times. But first of all, I just want to say there are pros and cons to all of these. There is not one that's a win-win-win for everybody. It kind of depends on your perspective and what's important to you, and we'll try to point some of those out. So there's some advantages and potentially some challenges or disadvantages to all of them. But the first option is for the city to just continue to conduct elections in the fall of odd years in August and November. Second option would be to consolidate the elections with the county primary and general elections, or the state primary and general elections, in the fall of even-numbered years. The third option would be to go to a November, where our first election would be in November, and a runoff election, if we had any, would be in March. So we'd be a November-March cycle rather than the other two, August and November, in either odd or even years. Now, consolidation does require charter amendments. The dates for our election and the terms and all of the things related to that are all in our city charter. So it has to be sent to the voters to amend it if we're going to consolidate. And so the council's considering referring options in the fall of 2018, which means it would be on the county ballot in either August or November. If the voters approved it, then we would be able to consolidate our elections into 2020. Currently, the city would be scheduled to hold a mayor election along with the council members in the odd districts in the fall of 2019. If the voters would approve consolidation, the thinking is we would then move those elections to the fall of 2020 and consolidate on the state ballot. Okay, now I'll go through just kind of an overview quickly of the differences between the three options, and then we'll go back through with some of the details and advantages and disadvantages of each of them. So the first option is the city continuing to conduct the elections. The city does conduct them. We do it ourselves. We are independent of the county, except that by state law, the county recorder maintains the voter registration rolls. So we get the voter registration roll from the county, and then we do everything else to conduct the election. We print the ballots, we count them, we mail them out, we operate the voting locations. For city elections, all of the voters on the permanent early voting list, regardless of their party affiliation, all automatically get a ballot for city elections. So, because we're nonpartisan, all voters get the same ballot. We don't have issues we'll talk about in a minute with the primary election in August and even years. Also, the city uses voting centers to do the voting at the polls. We implemented those in 2011. There's about 27 to 30 voting locations, voting centers, and voters can go to any of those that they want to. They don't have to go to the one designated polling place near their home. They can go to any of them that is convenient for them, and they can vote on Saturday, Monday, and Tuesday. We have them open all 3 days. So you have 3 days and about 29 locations that you can choose from for where you want to go vote. The city uses an August general and November runoff election. The city system is different from the county. It's not a primary general. So in the general election in August, if any candidate gets a majority of the votes cast, they are elected in that office, in that election. If nobody gets a majority, then the top two candidates go to a runoff election in November. And then the propositions, therefore, are put on the August ballot. So we don't have to have a ballot in November all the time. And you'll see that as we go through some of the data and turnout statistics. We only need a runoff election about 40% of the time. So we avoid having the second election, or it's not needed, 40% of the time. And then the cost. I'll give you a cost comparison for all of these. And these costs are based on a citywide election. Obviously, if we're not having a citywide, the costs are lower and they vary even for the county to conduct it. But for the city to conduct elections the way we're doing it now, a voting center election, it costs about $1 million. Most of that is printing and postage costs from printing and mailing all of the materials and voters to voters. Okay, the second option would be the August-November of even years, the regular state, primary, and general election. The county would conduct those elections. They're already conducting the election. The city items would appear on the ballot with all of the other state and county offices and federal offices on that ballot. The county does use the permanent early voting list for early voting, but for the August primary election, independent voters do not automatically receive their ballot by mail. I'll go over that some more in detail, but they can't get a ballot unless they designate which party ballot they want to receive or if they want the nonpartisan ballot. Again, we'll talk about that more in a minute. However, that's for the August election because it's a partisan primary election. In the November election, even though it's partisan, everybody gets the same ballot because in the August election, you've already picked the candidates, so everybody gets it. So in November, all of the voters, including the independents, automatically get their ballot by mail. Again, the August-November of even years is when it will be held, and then the cost. Because we are consolidating with the state general election, the state and the county and other jurisdictions that are on that ballot all share the cost. So the city's cost to put things on the county ballot would be about $500,000. So we would save some money as long as we were on the consolidated election date and having the county conduct it. Okay, the third option is the November and March option in even odd years. And this it's a hybrid kind of. The county would conduct the city elections in November, so we would put our items on their ballot in November. But if there was a runoff in March, the city would conduct the election in March, and I'll explain why that is in just a second. The permanent early voting list is used for early voting, and in November, this avoids the issue with the primary election in August. All of the voters on the people list, even independents, would get their ballot by mail in August automatically. They don't have to do anything to get that. And the other motivating factor for considering the November-March is that the turnout in the November elections, which we'll look at in a little bit, is the highest of all of them. So in trying to increase participation, moving to November would take advantage of that. The county does use polling places for that election, so everybody would have to go to the one designated polling place for their precinct, wherever that happened to be, and they're only open on election day. However, in March, the city conducting it, we would use voting centers again for the runoff election in March. For the cost, for the county to conduct that election in November, as we said, it would be about $500,000. But the March, we would conduct the voting center election, the city would, because it would cost us about $1 million for a citywide. If the county were to conduct that citywide election for the city, it would cost $2 million. So there's a savings of $1 million if the city conducts the March runoff election. Okay, now we'll go back through each one and with what are some of the pros and cons. I've talked about the items. Having the city elections in the odd years, as I said, was set up historically because of our nonpartisan elections. So it keeps the city elections, which are nonpartisan, separate from the partisan elections, particularly the August primary election and the November general, where people are running by party. Also, that ballot in November is long, right? There's a lot of things on it. So having the city elections in the fall of odd years allows the voters and the media to focus on the local issues in the local election and not have the potential of all of that getting lost on the local races on the ballot in August and November. So that's one concern. Again, in the city, all the permanent early voting list voters get their ballot in that election. As we talked about in the August primary, that would not be the case, and I'll explain that more in a minute. But there are about 500,000 voters on the permanent early voting list in Phoenix. That's the 70%. But just to let you know, even though we mail out ballots to 70% of the voters, only about 1/3 of those ballots get voted in return. So we mail them out, the voters get them, but as we've seen and we talked about for local elections, voters just tend to not participate, and so only about 1/3 of those ballots come back voted, which drops the turnout in city elections. And again, the cost would be about $1 million. One other factor with the city being separate is that because all we have is the mayor and council races on the ballot, we have about 90% of the ballot available for space for propositions. So we can we've had as many as 13 or 14 propositions on the ballot before, and if we don't have that many, we have more room to provide more explanation and description of the issues than what you will see on a county ballot, and we'll talk about that on those. But there's more information on the ballot in if we conduct them separately. Okay, for the August and November of even years, the regular county primary and general elections, the county again would conduct it for the city. City items would go on their ballot. And then in August, what you're really doing is selecting candidates by party to go on the general election ballot. So you have all the different parties have their list of candidates, and the top vote getter or two, depending on the race, then moves on to the general election to run off against the other parties. And as we mentioned, the permanent early voting list is used by the county for this August election. However, because it's a partisan election, for the voters who are not registered with a party, so they're registered as independent. They're not registered with an affiliation of the Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, or another party if there are any recognized parties. Those voters do not automatically get the ballot because they need to tell the county recorder, the election official, which ballot to send them. So all of the voters, if you're on the permanent early voting list, you know you get a postcard about 90 days before the election that says, hey, there's going to be an election, and gives you a chance to update your address or provide a temporary address if you're going to be away. The independent voters for that election get that postcard, but they have a response postcard where they need to return and they can check whether they want the ballot for the Republican Party or the Democratic Party or the Libertarian, or they have an option to check, I want the nonpartisan city ballot. So they could request a ballot that just had all the nonpartisan races or the city races on it, but they have to inform the county election officer what ballot they want, because if the county sends them just the nonpartisan ballot, if they want to vote in the parties, once they get that nonpartisan ballot and vote it, they can't vote the party races because all of the city races and everything are all on the party ballots. So everything is on those ballots, including that party's offices. Whereas on the nonpartisan city, it's just the city items. But you will have voted those, and so you can't get the party ballot later and vote it because everything is on that ballot. So all of the independent voters, in order to get their ballot, would have to notify the county by returning. They can do it by returning the postcard, or they can call in, or they can do it online. But they have to take action, or they will not receive their ballot by mail. They're still eligible to vote. They can call and request a ballot, or they can go to the polls. They just will not get it automatically by mail. The August, November of even your ballots, the August ballot is not so bad as far as space. There's usually space on that. So the city could get probably 4 to 6 propositions on that ballot and a little bit more description than what you would see on the November, but still not as much space as on the city, which raises the possibility that if you can't fit the items on the ballot, you might have to have a special election or send them to another and split up the propositions on different ballots. The amount of text, again, that could go on there is a little bit more than for the general, but not as much as on the city ballot. Okay? Now for the November, or let's look at the independent voter situation that I talked about. Here's just some numbers for you on how this affects the election and might affect the city election. In the last 2 Maricopa County primary elections in 2014 and 2016, you can see the numbers there. There were about 400,000 independents registered in the county that received that postcard. However, if you look at the last 2, in 2014, only about 19% of those voters returned that postcard and got their ballot by mail. The rest of them did not get a ballot by mail. And in 2016, it was even lower. Only about 15% of the independent voters sent the card in to request, or called, whatever, and requested a ballot. So only about 15% of those 400,000 got a ballot by mail to vote in return. The difference to the city of Phoenix elections, there's 148,000 independents on the permanent early voting list in Phoenix, and all 148,000 get the ballot by mail because we don't have the partisan primary issue. However, for full disclosure, I'll let you know that even though we mailed out 148,000, only about 20 to 25% of those voters have been participating even in the nonpartisan city elections. Just to look at the turnout numbers, this is a comparison of city voters that voted in the city election in the fall of odd years in the orange, and then the next bar is the fall of even years, the primary, county primary, the very next one. And you can see that in 2013 and 2014, the turnout was exactly the same for the city election and the county. But in the other years, it was slightly higher, 2 to 3% higher in the primary election than what is on the city ballot, or what is generally on a city election. So this difference in turnout, the problem with the independents not automatically getting their ballot in August, and the turnout not being very much different, is what led council to consider the November option. And here's a look at the November option, and then we'll look at the turnout there. Maybe we will. There we go. Okay, as I mentioned, this is kind of a hybrid, so the county would conduct the election in November. It would be on that general election ballot, and that's the ballot that has president or governor, state offices, state legislature, the other state offices, state propositions, judges, all of that is all on that ballot, and the city items and city propositions would be added to that. And all the state propositions that are voted on that year are also on that ballot, so it's a crowded ballot. The permanent early voting list is used, and again, because it's the general election in November, all the voters get the ballot. We don't have the issue that we have with the party primary in August. Polling places would be used, so voters have to go to the one designated place for their precinct, and it's only on election day. But for the runoff, the city would be conducting it, so we would do our normal method of conducting voting centers. The November election would be the first one. If there was a runoff needed, we'd be going to March. And you look at that time gap between November and March, you would have 5 months of campaign between what was the general election, the November election, and any runoff in March. So 5 months of campaigning. And for those of you who love campaign signs, they would be allowed to stay up during that time if they wanted to keep them up. Another concern that's been raised is, or a possible issue, is the March runoff. The turnout in the spring elections is even lower generally than the fall of the odd years when we're occurring them now. So we may have higher turnout in the first election in November, but for those that go to the runoff, the turnout may be even lower than what we're getting now. No way to know till that happens. Okay, here's an indication of what the turnout does in compared to the city elections to the state general elections. You see, in 2011, we had a runoff election. That was a citywide runoff for mayor. We had a 28, almost 29% turnout. The very next year was a presidential election in 2012. 74% of city voters participated in that election. Now, that is not what the turnout was overall for the entire county. That's the number of city voters that actually voted in that election. So we're comparing apples to apples. The actual turnout in the election was higher. Phoenix was below the turnout in that election, which was the highest in a long time for that election. Then in 2013, all the city had was a runoff in districts 4 and 8. We didn't have a citywide runoff, but the turnout in that one was 23%. And then that year in 2014, we had the governor's election at the state level, and 43% of city voters participated in that. So you see that there's even a drop-off from the governor's election to the presidential elections. The presidential elections are much higher even than the state offices. In 2015, there was no city runoff. Remember, I mentioned we don't have to have runoffs all the time. If candidates get elected in the first election by getting a majority, then there would be no runoff election. In our last election for mayor and the odd council districts in 2015, everybody got elected on the first election, so we had no runoff to compare. And then the presidential election this past one, there was almost 71% of Phoenix voters participated in that election. Okay, as I mentioned, charter amendments would be required to implement this, and there are several of them that would be considered by voters in the fall. The council is looking at possibly referring them to either the August or November ballot, so that if the voters approved it, we could then consolidate for the 2020, the next mayor and council election that would be held in 2019, would just be moved to 2020. Okay, that's all of the information that we have. We're happy to answer any questions. If you had any cards, you can fill them out. Do we have any cards, Ben, to bring up? So we don't have any. So I don't know, if you have any questions, we'll be happy to answer them, or if you want to make any comments, go ahead and we just have you fill out a card afterwards if you want to comment. Is that okay? So we'll stick around until the budget hearing will be about 6 o'clock. People will start coming in for that. So I'll be happy to answer any questions or go over anything for you if part of it's still confusing, or let me know. Thank you all for being here, and appreciate your comments if you have any for us.